The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin's reign witnessed one of history's most systematic and brutal systems of mass incarceration and execution, the Gulag. Between 1930 and 1953, these forced labor camps became synonymous with unimaginable cruelty, where execution was just one tool in an arsenal of terror designed to crush the human spirit. The birth of state terror. The Gulag system emerged as Stalin consolidated power in the late 1920s, transforming from a modest network of labor camps into a vast archipelago of suffering spanning the Soviet Union. The acronym Gulag stood for Glavnoye Upravlение Lagerei, main administration of camps, but it represented something far more sinister than its bureaucratic name suggested. More than 14 million people passed through the Gulag from 1929 to 1953, with an additional 7 to 8 million deported and exiled to remote areas. The system was born from Lenin's revolutionary violence, but reached its most horrific scale under Stalin's paranoid rule. The secret police, first the GPU and later the NKVD, transformed the Solovetsky Islands monastery into what Alexander Solzhenitsyn called the Mother of the Gulag in 1923. This remote Arctic location became a testing ground for methods of physical and psychological destruction that would later spread throughout the entire camp system. The machinery of death. Execution protocols within the Gulag system were characterized by their systematic brutality and deliberate secrecy. The NKVD's mass secret operations, particularly Order Number 0447 issued on July 30, 1937, established quotas for executions that regional officials were expected to meet during the Great Terror. These operations were conducted with absolute secrecy. No more than 100 high party and NKVD officials received copies of the operational orders, while other executioners received only oral instructions. The condemned were processed through troikas, three-person tribunals comprising the regional party first secretary, the NKVD chief, and the regional prosecutor. During half-day sessions, these tribunals would pronounce verdicts on several hundred cases, delivering either death sentences or 10-year Gulag terms. Death sentences were immediately enforceable, and the condemned were not even informed of their fate. Relatives were simply told their loved ones had been sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp, with no right to correspond, a lie that preserved the system's secrecy. Executions were carried out at night, either in prisons or in secluded NKVD-controlled areas on the outskirts of major towns. The obsession with secrecy extended to detailed instructions about execution methods. Immediately on receipt of this order, you are to present a list of NKVD staff permitted to participate in executions. Red Army soldiers or ordinary policemen are not to be employed. The locations of these special shooting ranges included Butovo near Moscow, Levashovo outside Leningrad, Bykivnia near Kiev, and Sandamok in Karelia. Methods of execution. The primary method of execution in the Gulag system was shooting, typically with a bullet to the back of the head from a small-caliber rifle. At Auschwitz, which adopted similar methods, condemned prisoners were led to execution walls in pairs, where SS executioners shot them from behind. Soviet execution sites followed comparable procedures, with bodies immediately removed by designated prisoners to crematoria or mass burial sites. The scale of executions varied by location and time period. At Solovki, the transformation from a testing ground for camp administration into an execution site during the Great Terror demonstrated the system's evolution toward pure extermination. In October 1937, over 1,000 prisoners were transported from Solovki to the mainland for execution at Sandamok, where NKVD Captain Mikhail Matveyev systematically murdered 1,111 prisoners between October 27 and November 10th. Among the victims were 289 members of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, part of what became known as the executed Renaissance. When winter conditions prevented further transports across the frozen White Sea, executions continued on Solovki itself. Between 200 and 300 prisoners were shot near Sekhenaya Hill, including Yelizaveta Katz, an 8 months pregnant engineer who was allowed to give birth before being executed 3 months later, on May 16, 1938. At age 28, the Kolyma death machine, the Kolyma region, centered around Magadan, became synonymous with death on an industrial scale. Often called the Land of White Death, Kolyma represented the most brutal extreme of the Gulag system. The region's gold mines operated as virtual death factories, where prisoners were worked to death in temperatures that regularly dropped below 50 degrees, 58 degrees Celsius. Alexander Biryukov, a Magadan lawyer whose father was imprisoned in the Gulag, documented the systematic nature of executions in Kolyma. His research identified 11,000 people officially documented as shot by the NKVD in Kolyma camps alone. However, this figure represents only those whose executions were formally recorded. Countless others simply disappeared into the permafrost without any documentation. The transportation to Kolyma itself became a form of execution. Prisoners were shipped from Vladivostok to Magadan aboard overcrowded vessels known as death ships. Between 1932 and 1953, approximately 900,000 prisoners were transported by ship to Magadan, with mortality rates averaging 27% during transport. Many prisoners died before ever reaching the camps, their bodies thrown overboard into the Sea of Okhotsk. At the camps themselves, executions took multiple forms. Beyond the standard shooting, prisoners were subjected to systematic starvation, exposure, and deliberate medical neglect that amounted to slow execution. The permafrost preserved many bodies, creating a vast frozen cemetery across the region. Biryukov noted that some bodies remained partially preserved decades later, providing grim evidence of the scale of killing. Perm 36, the Political Execution Center, Perm 36, established in 1946 near the Russian-Siberian border, evolved into one of the most feared execution sites for political prisoners. Initially designed as a logging camp for approximately 1,000 prisoners, it transformed after Stalin's death into a specialized facility for executing officials from the repressive organs who had been deemed guilty of groundless repressive measures. During the Stalinist era, the camp's most sinister evolution came in 1972 when it was converted into the harshest political prison in the Soviet Union. Featuring the only special regime facility of its kind, this section housed political prisoners in 24-hour closed cells, essentially solitary confinement chambers designed to break the human psyche before execution. Prisoners designated as especially dangerous state, criminals were held in conditions that amounted to psychological torture, preceding their inevitable death sentences. The execution procedures at Perm 36 were methodical and cruel. Political prisoners who continued to resist Soviet ideology after previous prison terms were systematically eliminated through a combination of execution and torture designed to appear as natural death. The camp operated for over 40 years until its closure in 1988, making it one of the longest operating execution facilities in the Gulag system. The psychology of terror beyond immediate execution, the Gulag system employed sophisticated psychological torture designed to break prisoners before they died. The Kaza, specialized solitary confinement cells, represented perhaps the most dreaded formal punishment. These unheated concrete boxes, often too small for prisoners to lie down, became instruments of slow torture during Siberian winters. Former prisoner Evgenia Ginsburg described her experience in a Kaza as death that never quite arrives. At Makadan's transit prison, the Kazas were built below ground level, where permafrost ensured temperatures never rose above freezing, even in summer. Prisoners were stripped to their undergarments before confinement, and guards occasionally sprayed water into the cells, creating ice chambers that pushed human endurance beyond its limits. A standard 5-day sentence in the Kaza during winter months frequently resulted in frostbite, pneumonia, or death. Sleep deprivation emerged as another weapon that left no physical marks but steadily eroded sanity. Gustav Herling, who survived Kolyma, described how after 3 days without sleep, hallucinations began, and after 5 days, prisoners would confess to anything, including killing your own mother, if it meant they could close their eyes. At Solovki's punishment isolator, prisoners were forced to sit on narrow perches on staircases day and night, where falling asleep meant tumbling down stone steps. Modern torture methods documented in contemporary Russian prisons reveal the continuation of these brutal traditions. At Krasnoyarsk's EPKT-31 facility, prisoners describe systematic torture, including being wrapped in mattresses while their limbs are twisted until ligaments tear, being beaten on their heels with wooden mallets, having bags placed over their heads until they lose consciousness, and being subjected to electric shock torture. These methods demonstrate the direct lineage from Stalin's execution protocols to contemporary Russian prison practices. Witness testimonies. Few survivors who lived to tell their stories provide harrowing accounts of the system's brutality. Vasily Kovalyov, who died in 2018 at age 89, was one of the last Kolyma survivors from the Stalin era. Condemned in 1950 at age 20 for anti-Soviet sabotage, based solely on an old saber he used to chop vegetables, Kovalyov spent years in the harshest camps of the Soviet system. Kovalyov's journey through the system began at Norilsk in the Russian Arctic, where temperatures regularly dropped to lethal levels. After guards discovered an escape plot, he was transferred to Kolyma, a punishment that amounted to a death sentence for most prisoners. The transfer itself was designed as torture. Prisoners were transported in cattle cars without heat or adequate food, with many dying en route. During a 1954 escape attempt, Kovalyov and 2 other inmates hid in a mine for 5 months, surviving in darkness and freezing conditions. After 3 months we had eaten all our food, and in the end we were chewing wood shavings, he recalled. When they finally emerged, they were half-blind like moles but were quickly recaptured. His experience illustrates the desperate lengths prisoners would go to escape a system designed to destroy them completely. Another survivor's testimony reveals the psychological torture methods employed during interrogation. That's when the real prison life began. It was terrible, with endless nighttime interrogations, weeks without sleep. You lose all consciousness, all orientation. It's all over, nothing remains. The systematic nature of this torture demonstrates how execution was just one tool in a comprehensive system of human destruction. The scale of death determining. Exact death tolls from Gulag executions remains challenging due to the secretive nature of the operations and the destruction of many records. Official Soviet estimates indicate that more than 14 million people passed through the Gulag from 1929 to 1953, with archival data revealing 799,455 recorded executions between 1921 and 1953. However, these figures likely underrepresent the true scale of killing. Recent archival research suggests that between 1.5 and 1.7 million people died in the Gulag system from 1930 to 1953, though historian Golfo Alexopoulos believes at least 6 million people died as a result of their detention in the gulags. The discrepancy stems from the common practice of releasing prisoners who were suffering from incurable diseases or near death, allowing the system to manipulate mortality statistics. In her 2018 study, Alexopoulos found that a systematic practice was to release sick prisoners on the verge of death, and that prisoners classified as invalid, light physical labor, or physically defective encompassed at least 1/3 of all inmates. The discovery of mass graves continues to reveal the extent of the executions. At Sandamok alone, archaeological work has identified at least 6,000 bodies across 130 burial pits, though the actual number may be much higher. Similar mass graves have been found near Moscow and other major Soviet cities, containing thousands of execution victims from Stalin's purges. The permafrost in regions like Kolyma has preserved bodies for decades, providing ongoing evidence of the systematic nature of these killings. The bureaucracy of murder. What makes the Gulag executions particularly chilling is their bureaucratic efficiency. The system operated according to quotas and procedures that transformed mass murder into routine administrative work. Regional NKVD officials were given specific numbers of people to execute, and failure to meet these quotas could result in punishment for the officials themselves. The trials that preceded executions were mere theater. Show trials with predetermined outcomes served as propaganda tools, while the troikas processed cases with assembly line efficiency. The entire legal framework was corrupted to serve the state's murderous agenda, with Communist Party ideologues struggling to reconcile the use of the death penalty with their proclaimed goal of creating a communist utopia. Some NKVD officials became so comfortable with the killing that they developed coded language, referring to executions as weddings and inviting colleagues to observe the murders despite strict secrecy protocols. This casual attitude toward mass murder reveals how thoroughly the system had normalized the taking of human life. At facilities like Perm 36, former chief wardens personally participated in torture and executions, with many subsequently promoted to higher positions in the prison system, demonstrating the institutional rewards for brutality. Legacy of terror. The brutal executions in Stalin's gulags represent one of the 20th century's greatest crimes against humanity. The system's sophistication in combining immediate execution with prolonged torture and degradation created a level of human suffering that challenges comprehension. Unlike the Nazi concentration camps, which were designed primarily for systematic extermination, the Gulag system combined the worst of both worlds: industrial-scale killing alongside prolonged torture, disguised as corrective labor. The psychological impact on survivors was devastating. Camp records from Gulag in Kazakhstan documented rates of self-inflicted deaths 20 times higher than in the general Soviet population, with prisoners throwing themselves into machinery, onto electric fences, or swallowing shards of glass. Perhaps most disturbing were the self-mutilations, where prisoners severed their own fingers or hands to escape deadly work assignments, calculating that punishment for self-harm offered better survival odds than continuing their assigned labor. The secrecy surrounding these executions meant that many families never learned the fate of their loved ones. The lie that condemned prisoners had been sentenced to 10 years without correspondence rights allowed the state to maintain its fiction of legal process while conducting systematic murder. This deception added psychological torture to the family's suffering, leaving them to wonder for decades about the fate of disappeared relatives. Today, efforts to preserve the memory of these atrocities face political pressure. The closure of the Perm 36 Museum in 2014 due to withdrawn government funding reflects ongoing attempts to suppress historical truth about the Gulag system. The dissolution of Memorial, Russia's premier human rights organization documenting Soviet repressions, represents a continuation of state efforts to control the narrative about these historical crimes. Conclusion: the brutal executions in Stalin's gulags reveal the depths of systematic cruelty that totalitarian regimes can achieve when unconstrained by law, morality, or human decency. The combination of bureaucratic efficiency with sadistic creativity produced a system of murder and torture that claimed millions of lives while traumatizing countless others. The victims included not only political prisoners and enemies of the state, but also common criminals, ethnic minorities, and ordinary citizens caught in the machinery of terror. These executions were not aberrations or excesses of an otherwise legitimate system. They were integral to the Gulag's function as an instrument of state terror. The careful documentation of procedures, the establishment of quotas, and the elaborate secrecy protocols all demonstrate that these murders were deliberate policy decisions made at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. The testimony of survivors like Vasily Kovalyov and the archaeological evidence from mass graves ensure that this history cannot be forgotten or denied, serving as a permanent reminder of the horrors that result when states are given unlimited power over their citizens' lives. The discovery and documentation of execution sites continues today, with researchers working against political pressure and official secrecy to uncover the truth about this dark chapter in human history. Their work ensures that the victims of Stalin's brutal execution system are not forgotten, and that future generations understand the true cost of totalitarian rule. The preservation of sites like Perm 36 and the documentation of mass graves across the former Soviet Union stand as monuments to human resilience and the importance of remembering history's darkest chapters.